War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy, published in 1985, is another war poem. And like Poppies, it gives us a new perspective of war, this time from someone whose profession and livelihood is inextricably linked to conflict. Have you ever seen vivid pictures of war zones and wondered about the person behind the photograph of these disasters? Well, this poem gives us a glimpse into the life of someone who captures such haunting images for a living. As usual, in this video, we will read the poem and discuss what it's about. We'll think a bit about its context before annotating it, paying attention to language and form. And finally, we will think about which other poems in the Power and Conflict Anthology you could compare it to. So make sure you stay until the end for that. In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church, and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So what's the poem about? It follows a war photographer who has returned to his darkroom to develop some photographs he took from a conflict zone. And a darkroom is somewhere where you develop film. Remember, film is not the same as digital photography. And in the 1980s, when this was written, there weren't any digital photos. As he works, as he develops the photos, he reflects on the horrors and struggles he has witnessed through the lens of his camera. And he thinks about the contrast to the suffering he has witnessed firsthand and the apparent indifference of people back home. And he really struggles with that indifference. Finally, it's implied that he returns to the war zone because he feels so disjointed and out of place in a conflict-free zone. The poem explores the emotional and moral struggle of someone who documents war but remains powerless to stop it. And it highlights the disconnection between those who experience war firsthand and those who absorb it through the media. Let's think a bit about the context. The poem is written by Carol Ann Duffy, who was the Poet Laureate and is known for exploring themes of memory, conflict, and human suffering. The poem itself is inspired by a photographer called Don McCullin, who captured images of war in Vietnam and Northern Ireland. We have to remember it was written in the 1980s, during a time when war photography was becoming a powerful tool of raising awareness of what was going on in war zones. Remember, before, it sometimes would have been just propaganda, or they would have been hearing reports of what was happening. But now there was a tool to document in real life the horrific images of what was going on in these war zones. And the poem therefore deals with this emotional struggle of this war photographer and what he grapples with, but it also highlights the general population's desensitization to violence. People see these conflicts on TV or in the media, but then they quickly forget about it and return to their everyday lives. And it's that ability to forget and return to the everyday that so troubles the war photographer in the poem. Let's do our annotations.
As usual, let's start thinking about the title, War Photographer. The main thing to note here is the lack of article. It's not the war photographer or a war photographer, and that shows us it's exploring a universal experience when it comes to someone whose livelihood is dependent on conflict, perhaps. And this opening line, in his dark room he is finally alone. Now this dark room could be both literal and metaphorical, because a dark room is where a photographer develops their photographs. That is his literal darkroom, it's his professional darkroom where he develops the photographs, but also you have the foreboding metaphorical connotations of dark as well. What does that mean he is finally alone? Obviously there is a distinct sense of isolation in those lines, but as though he's been waiting to be alone. And we ask ourselves why? Is it because he needs to process what he's witnessed? And then we have spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. And a spool is that cylinder. It's a device that you use to hold the film. What do we notice here, though? There is a distinct juxtaposition between these two aspects of the line, because there is the chaotic nature that underlines this, and that contrasts with these neat and ordered rows that are described. So the chaotic nature of that contrasts against the neat arrangement of the ordered rows. And we could interpret this in more than one way. Remember, if you are aiming for those high-level responses that get grade 8 or 9 or level 6 in the marking, you need to explore multiple interpretations. So the neat ordered rows, it could reflect the photographer's attempt to impose order, especially after the endless suffering he has witnessed. In order to take control or appear like he can regain control, he wants to impose some sort of order. And the only way to do that is to set out these neat rows, even though what the rows contain are these documents of suffering. But another interpretation, in terms of neat and ordered rows, I don't know, but does it also evoke a more sinister image? And that's of a graveyard, of graves being neatly rowed. Often in a cemetery, you have rows of graves. That could be something you extricate from it. And here then you have this religious simile, comparing the darkroom to a church and the photographer developing it to a priest. Again, you can have different interpretations of this simile. Certainly, it creates a very somber tone, and it adds gravity to the photographer's actions. But what else? Is it that he's doing something sacred? Mass, intoning a mass. It's a very ritualistic process, so it involves a lot of ritual. So perhaps that's likening his process, the photographer's process, to being that sort of a sacred ritual. Him going over and developing the photographs of what he has witnessed. It has that same level of gravity. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. So this is obviously a list of the conflicts then photographer has witnessed, but you have a lot of plosive consonants there. And those plosive consonants, remember, you always have to identify an effect of the method. They heighten the sense of violence. All flesh is grass. We have here a biblical allusion, because that alludes to the Bible. And what does that biblical allusion do? It reminds us that life is fleeting. And perhaps that is what the photographer has been constantly reminded on his travels during his work, because he's seen so much life destroyed and taken away. And the second stanza, he has a job to do. Simple, businesslike, that is his profession. It's very blunt. And then it refers to his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So counterintuitively, his hands are trembling more now than they did in those moments of conflict. So in those moments of conflict, braver, he was steadier, he was calmer perhaps. And that is perhaps because of the adrenaline of the moment. Often when there are moments of crisis, a deeper self emerges, one that's more able to cope. But also it could show that he's experiencing delayed trauma, that now when he looks back on what he witnessed, he's now trembling and traumatized. Home again, but there's no comfort in being home, as we'll see. Rural England. Home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can't dispel. We know immediately there is a contrast between rural England and the place that he has come from. But this to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, it does somewhat dismiss and disregard ordinary pain. There is a disdainful tone here that will come into effect later as well. It's dismissive then of regular pain. People can still experience pain and still have a painful life even when they're not in a war zone. But what it's demonstrating is the shift in perspective of the photographer. He's almost angry at the comparative easiness of life, of everyday life. And because of what he's witnessed, that almost makes him angry. He's saying, no, you don't know pain. Your pain can be blown away on a sunny day. Obviously, we know that's not true, but it's showing that's what the photographer thinks, and that is how much his perspective has been shifted by what he has witnessed. And in the next lines, we can understand why. The fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. There is a picture of children running away Vietnam that when this poem was published, potentially readers would have recalled of the Vietnamese running away from napalm. So perhaps it recalls that, but it is a shocking image because it's alluding to children being blown up. That's so grim and so horrific. So that shocking image is sharpened by the fact that it's children she's alluding to, but you have a rhyming couplet there, and it's very jarring. It creates this sing-song effect that goes against the horrific nature of what the lines are describing. It's contrary to them. So the sing-song aspect of that couplet is jarring and discordant with the horror within the lines of these children being blown up. And again, something is happening. Just like he has a job to do, something's happening. We have this blunt directness. A stranger's feature faintly start to twist before his eyes. So physically, it's referring to the physical act of the image being developed. And if you don't know what I mean because you're only familiar with digital photographs, when a film photograph is being developed, it's in fluid, and the image that it contains gradually starts to become clearer. And that's what this is referring to. But this idea of it twisting, this could be because it's developing, but also the word twist, that definitely connotes pain and agony and contortion. So we can imagine the features of this stranger being contorted with pain, which leads us on to this line heightened by the fact that it's followed by a caesura, a break in the line of poetry. A half-formed ghost. And so it's half-formed because it's a photograph developing, but it also alludes to death. Obviously, that word ghost. It evokes death. And what else does this word ghost make us think? It makes us think that the photographer is being haunted. So there's been quite a genius coupling there from Carol Ann Duffy of that sort of translucent, that sort of half-transparent quality of a photograph developing, this half-translucent when it's just not yet fully formed, ghost-like, but that is also raising the awareness of and death. And this bit is interesting. He remembers the cries of this man's wife. So the man whose image is becoming clear, he remembers his wife crying. How he sought approval without words to do what someone must. What do you think here? I wonder what the implication of this is. Does it imply that he put this man out of his misery? Because this person's clearly in a lot of pain, his face is contorted with pain, and how he sought approval without words to do what someone must. It could be taking the photograph and documenting the horrors, or, much more sinister, does it imply that actually he had to take this man's life, put him out of his misery, because he was in so much pain and suffering so much? That is one much grimmer interpretation. And the fact that the blood stained into foreign dust, for me, that perhaps consolidates it a bit. He was forced to do something he really didn't want to do. And this is a very violent image, blood staining the ground, that captures the brutal truth of war. And this staining seeping into the desert of this faraway land, this foreign dust. Think about the contrast to the rural fields or rural England mentioned earlier with a capital. Blood-soaked foreign dust could not be more different to the rural England he's returned to, and no wonder he feels so uncomfortable with that. We have this last stanza, 100 agonies. That reminds me of exposure and the twitching agonies it describes in that. But it's exposing the pain that the photographer has witnessed. And it being in black and white, again, that could be both literal and metaphorical. Literal in the sense that they're black and white photographs, but metaphorical in that there's a lot of extremes in war. Things tend to be black and white. You live or you die. That could again be another interpretation. From which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. For Sunday's supplement is the paper. So these hundreds of agonies laid out in these photographs, his editor will need to pick some of them out for the paper. And there is definitely a tone of disdain here, like there was earlier, of dismissing the pain of regular everyday people at home. It causes the photographer discomfort that these photographs documenting all this suffering, the purpose is just for them to be picked out of a line and some of them to make it into Sunday's paper for people to look at. And obviously they're going to want to sell the papers. So there's something that's very jarring for the photographer, that the photos of this suffering are serving a commercial purpose because they're there to sell newspapers. That really doesn't sit well with him. And this disdain is then continued. Notice this, the reader's eyeballs prick, not the reader's eyes prick with tears, but the reader's eyeballs. And that, it detracts from the reader's emotional response. There's something very mechanical about referring to them as eyeballs instead of their eyes welled with tears. And it's showing that there's something about the reader's response that is rudimentary and crude, that it's not a true response. There's something disingenuous about the tears. There's something fake about their tears. Disdain is continued here. I was pricked with tears between the bar and pre-lunch beers. So full of disapproval there, of people carrying on with their everyday lives. And you have the internal rhyme, tears and beers. And that internal rhyme shows how disapproving the photographer is, that, you know, these pictures will just, they'll elicit a reaction for a moment and they'll make the eyeballs prick with tears. But actually, the real life won't be interrupted. It's not going to have much of an impact on someone's everyday life. And again, there's something in that the photographer disapproves of because he's been so close to conflict. And so really, this whole stanza highlights the societal apathy towards war. And remember, apathy is indifference, when you don't care about something. Whenever you have words with the root pathos, pathos is for feeling. So think sympathy, empathy, antipathy, and apathy. If someone is apathetic, they don't care. So this whole stanza highlights how society doesn't care enough about the conflict happening in other parts of the world. The photographer then, the war photographer, when he returns from these places of conflict, he really struggles to just go back to everyday life. And he feels anger and resentment towards other people. Actually, resentment would be a better word than disdain, a tone of resentment. He really resents the people being able to just go back to their everyday lives. And really, from the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living. So that implies that he is returning to the war zone, perhaps because he finds it so difficult to just return to everyday life. And this whole stanza, they do not care. They, the everyday person, and that is just highlighting this idea of societal apathy, of social apathy. And this whole stanza emphasizes the disconnect between those who experience war and those who consume it through the media. And that's what the whole poem does. So the other poems in the collection have given us an insight and perspective into a soldier. We've been shown the perspective of someone whose loved one has gone to war in Poppies. And now we've been shown the perspective of someone whose every day is bound up with conflict. Their business, their livelihood is connected to war because their job is to capture the images of war. It's given us a whole new perspective there. And what it's really thrown up is how resentful he's become at the ability for everybody else in the world to just carry on. But he cannot carry on because of the horrors he has witnessed in war.
The poem is in quite a rigid structure, and it's divided into 6-line stanzas with quite a uniform rhyme scheme of A, B, B, C, D, D. This could be interpreted in different ways. The stiff order within the poem could be seen to undermine the chaos of the conflicts that the war photographer is documenting, or it could reflect a desire to impose a certain amount of order on a world that seems to have no order at all and be completely dissolving. There's that line in the first stanza that he organises the film into ordered rows, and perhaps that looking to impose some sort of order then infiltrates the poetic form as well. So, which poems could you compare War Photographer to? You could compare it to Remains because both explore trauma and PTSD in war. Remains, however, is from the perspective of the soldier, and War Photographer is from the perspective of a witness to the war, someone who documents it but doesn't actually take part in it. You could compare it to Poppies because both deal with memory and the impact of war on those at home. And you could also compare it to Exposure because both poems highlight the brutality of war and society's lack of awareness. And there you have it. I hope that was helpful. War Photographer is a powerful poem which encourages us to question how we engage with war and suffering, even when that war and suffering is taking place somewhere else. If you're revising, make sure you focus on its themes of memory, trauma, and societal apathy to war. Like so many others in the collection, it's a very haunting poem because it gives us a window into someone whose experience is the everyday living of war. He makes his living from war, but who must therefore, on a daily basis, grapple with the moral dilemmas and the emotional trauma that comes with that.